Good evening. Tonight we're going to have a lecture from Professor Carl Fox. Professor Carl Fox is a history professor at Conestoga College for 28 years. Okay. He was a former member of the United States Marine Corps. I think it was approximately 8 years? 6 years in the Marine Corps, serving in Southeast Asia, those areas there. And for the last 8 years, he's been doing a lot of research on various expeditions to the Antarctica and the Arctic. He's been in 130 different countries. So in 2010, he participated in an expedition to South Georgia Island in the Antarctica, which traced Shackleton's last leg of his expedition to safety. And the presentation will be on leadership and endurance that occurred in that expedition in 1914. So Professor Carl Fox, do you want to take over? And
okay, thank you.
Do a little talk.
Good evening. Okay, this evening we're going to be looking at Shackleton's expedition to the Antarctic, as the captain just mentioned. He put this ad in the paper in 1911, seeking recruits to go to who knows where. Men wanted for hazardous journeys, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. They weren't too certain about the success. This is Shackleton here, and we're going to look at endurance, courage, and leadership under adverse conditions. Now, it was the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914 to 1917, of course, led by Shackleton, and this is used as a case study at Quantico, Virginia, in the United States as part of the Marine Corps training program, officer training program. Some of the points they cover in leadership, and we won't have time to go into all of these, but are certain things you must know as a leader, such as your chain of command. I assume you're familiar with that. Maintenance of equipment and personnel is paramount. And remember, troops first, officers second. Maintain high morale under adverse conditions. Delegate authority, assign jobs to people, in other words. Set an excellent example. Select officers and NCOs that you know are dependable, and don't harass the troops. Okay, the background information before we actually get into the expedition. In the Antarctic, there are actually 5 different South Poles. When they say going to the South Pole, of course, they usually mean the geographic South Pole. But also there's the inaccessible South Pole, which is the hardest point to get to in the Antarctic. The coldest part of in the Antarctic, called the cold South Pole. Then you have the geographic and magnetic South Pole, which is sort of in between the magnetic and the geographic center. And of course, the last one is the magnetic South Pole, which at present time is 68 degrees south and 145 degrees east. Now, this is a map here of the Antarctic. This is Argentina. Over here, this is Australia. Africa's up here. The South Pole is right about here. The magnetic South, that's the geographic one. Magnetic South Pole's down here. Coldest area is right in this area, which is a Russian base, and up here, of course, is the most inaccessible. The areas we'll be looking at is the Weddell Sea here, and the Ross Ice Shelf at McMurdo Sound in this area here. Now, it's 600 miles from the Antarctic to South America, or South America, yes, 1,500 to Australia. It has 90% of the world's fresh water, 99% of the land mass is permanently ice. It's the 5th largest continent, and it was first more or less discovered in 1773 by Captain Cook. Okay, background information. In the 19th and 20th century, there was a real push in Europe and throughout the world that was somewhat similar to the space race we had here. Who's going to be the first to the moon, the Russians or the Americans? Well, at that time, it was who's going to be the first man to the South Pole? Who's going to be the first woman, perhaps, or man to the North Pole? Who's going to find the Northwest Passage? Who's going to find the source of the Nile River? And there was competitions between all the many countries, especially England and Norway, France and Germany, to be the #1 country when it came to exploration. There was a chap called Barrow in England who was the head of the National Geographic Society for the UK. He would send out numerous expeditions to discover these different areas. And one of the first ones they started at was, let's go to the North Pole. Let's find the Northwest Passage, because if we can find the Northwest Passage that goes from Europe across northern Canada, which is now presently northern Canada, into Asia and China, it'll be an excellent trade route. The problem was getting through all that ice. And the first expedition, or one of the first, was by Henry Hudson. Of course, Hudson Bay is named after him, in 1611, and his ship just disappeared. They don't know to this day actually what happened, although he was supposedly, his crew said they set him adrift. Then they had the Franklin expedition in 1845, and that disappeared also, although it had 2 ships. It wasn't until 50 years later they ran across a few hints of what had happened to these people. And many other ships since then, of course, have been lost. And around 1908 and 1909, 2 gentlemen, one called Perry, the other one Cook, both Americans, both claimed to have walked to the North Pole. These, by the way, are the remains of some of the grave sites of some of the members of Franklin's expedition up in Beechey Island. And there was no real proof that Perry or Cook had actually set foot on the North Pole or that area, because they didn't take any readings. However, the Congress of the United States recognized Perry as the first person to be in the North Pole, or to land in the North Pole, and Cook, of course, he was not considered. Now, but neither of them had any readings, and it wasn't until 1969 that someone actually walked to the North Pole overland, and that was a Brit called Wally Herbert with 3 companions and 40 huskies, and it was proof. However, in 2005, a British explorer went back and traced Perry's route and concluded that, yes, Perry could have been the one that was the first one to the North Pole. Then we have this chap here called Ronald Amundsen, a Norwegian civilian. When Amundsen heard the North Pole had been reached, he immediately headed for the Antarctic. Now, Amundsen was one of the foremost explorers, Arctic explorers of his day, and by far the best, for the simple reason he went and he lived with the Inuit, and he learned the ways of the Inuit. He learned how to hunt, how to make clothing, and most important of all, he learned how to handle dogs, because dogs were, at that time, was the key for transportation in this type of area. And so he was on his way to be the first man to go to the North Pole when he got the word that, lo and behold, Perry had been there before. So he said, oh, well, let's try the South Pole. So he turned the ship around and he headed down to the Antarctic for the South Pole. Well, there had been another chap down there, who I'll talk about in a minute, called Scott, who was an Englishman who was on his way to look for the South Pole already. Now, getting back to Amundsen, he was the first person to traverse the Northwest Passage by ship in 1903, which was quite a feat. Foremost in his field, an expert on using sled dogs, and unfortunately, he died in 1928 searching for other Arctic explorers who had been lost. Dogs, 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 why are the best? And we'll get that a little later. Now, this was Robert Scott Falcon, who was an Englishman and a naval officer in the British Royal Navy. And he led an expedition in 1901 and 1904 that tried to reach the South Pole. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. And so he tried again in 1910 to 1913. And he reached the pole on January the 7th, 1912, only to find that Amundsen had been there 35 days before him, right? And so then he had to go on a return journey back to his base camp. Well, he didn't quite make it. He and his group perished 10 miles from their next food depot. They were that close to to making it, but they didn't. He made some major errors in judgment versus Amundsen. He took 5 men. He originally thought he'd take 4 men on the dash to the South Pole, and then he changed his mind. He took an extra man, 5. Well, everything had been based on 4, right? The food allotment, the tent for 4 people, now it had to hold 5. Made some mistakes like that. He pulled his sleds. He didn't use dogs. And that was the cause of his downfall, unfortunately. He used ponies, Siberian ponies, which do not last as well as dogs do. They used vehicles, which were of very little use, all right? And he did it the hard way. This is Scott doing his log in his camp in the Antarctic. These were the 5 men that made it to the pole with Scott, and this picture was taken. Of course, none of these men returned. Of course, they found this picture with their corpses when they discovered them in a tent where they had all perished. Travel stats. Amundsen using dogs and Scott using manpower. Scott could only go 3 or 4 miles a day, pulling these 200-pound sleds per man for 10 or 12 hours a day. At the end of the day, when they were exhausted. Amundsen, on the other hand, could go up to 60 miles a day. He averaged 23 miles a day on these sleds, and he had much more time to relax. Why? Dogs. Now, why are dogs better than Siberian ponies? Those Siberian ponies are pretty rough. I've ridden some of them on occasion, and boy, they're tough little animals. But the problem is, how do dogs sweat? Anyone know how dogs sweat? By their tongue. The dogs sweat through their tongue. Ponies don't do that. So dogs don't have that perspiration freezing on their bodies, right? Also, when ponies go through deep snow, their feet go right into it. Dogs got big paws. They walk on top of the snow. Also, dogs can scent bears, seals. They can even scent crevasses, okay? And they don't need a horizon. They don't have to look at a horizon and know where to go, where ponies do. All these were the advantages of using dogs over horses, and that's why Amundsen won the race, that particular pole. But, so that's the discovery of the North and South Pole. But now we look at Shackleton. He was a British merchant naval officer, Anglo-Irish from County Kildare in Ireland. He gained some experience. He started off his apprenticeship at the age of 16, 1898. He was a merchant Navy master mariner. In 1901, he was on Scott's Antarctic expedition, and they came very close to making it to the South Pole, but they only made it to 82 degrees south. And Shackleton became ill and had to be sent home, so he didn't get to complete the expedition, although no one reached the pole on this attempt. In 1907, he decided, I will try to reach the pole. So he started the Nimrod expedition, and they made a very, very good attempt with Shackleton leading it, but they didn't make it to the South Pole neither. It managed to reach 88 degrees south, or excuse me, the party managed to reach 88 degrees, 23 degrees south, and was only 112 miles from the South Pole. But he knew if he went on, he would lose his group, right? They wouldn't quite make it because of the food problem they had. They were running out of food. So much so on the return journey that Shackleton gave one of the last biscuits in his kit to his friend Frank Wild. And of course, Frank Wild never forgot that and became a very, very loyal officer under Shackleton's command in the future. The expedition did accomplish the first ascent of Mount Erebus, which is the highest mountain in Antarctica, 12,400 feet. And they got to the location of the magnetic pole, and Shackleton returned to Hero to England for his expedition. But they didn't reach the pole, right? No one had reached the pole yet. That's what it looks like today, by the way. Okay. He said, well, why didn't you carry on and go for it? He says, well, I could have tried to reach the South Pole, but it's better to have 5 lambs than 5 dead lions. In other words, his men would have perished. So he then went on tour, 1906, 7, 8, and he tried to raise funds for another expedition to the Antarctic, because once again, it would be like being the first man on the moon if he could do it. And he managed to have enough funds in 1914, but by then, the South Pole had been reached already, right? Amundsen had reached the South Pole. So what was he going to do? Well, my expedition will be the first expedition to go right across the continent, traverse the continent. That's what we'll do. And his object was to get a team of 6 and cross the continent from the Weddell Sea to McMurdo Sound, a distance of close to 3,000 kilometers. And once again, he was going to land here through this ice shelf, land here at Weddell Strait, this is the Weddell Sea here, walk across here, here's the South Pole, and to the Ross ice shelf, and this is McMurdo area here. And he would have been the first man to do this, all right? Once again, he wouldn't be the first man on the moon, but it's equivalent to being perhaps the second. Shackleton's Wanad, as I mentioned, I read before. He put this in the London Times. Fortunately, he only needed 28 men, and he had no problem getting that. Captain Frank Worsley was at the helm of the ship. Shackleton was the leader. Worsley was the captain of the vessel, which was called the Endurance. He sent a second vessel down to Aurora in McMurdo Sound to lay down a supply depot. Right here, and so they would land here, and then they would set supply depots up here. So when Shackleton came down this way, he would find the supplies waiting for him. So he didn't have to carry an enormous amount of supplies on this expedition. That's his Wanad, as I mentioned. Okay. Now, he first went to what's called South Georgia Island. And on South Georgia Island, there was Norwegian whaling and sealing vessels, right? And they would work here, and they would work this area here for the whales and the seals. So Shackleton's troops set up here, and then they took off down to this area here where the Endurance's ship was trapped in ice, okay? And we'll catch this other part in a moment or two. I have this map a few times. On the 15th of December, it sailed from South Georgia, and January the 15th, a month or so later, a little more than a month, he was frozen in the ice floe and he couldn't get to the land. His ship was frozen. Well, he can't make the land. What's he going to do? So he made the ship into a winter station. And they were adrift in the Weddell Sea. Oh, I hope this goes somewhere. And of course, on the ship, what's there to do? Well, they did have some dogs, and they had books to read, and they would put on plays, and they would hope that they would drift out of this ice pack when the warmer weather came. The breaking up of the ice puts extreme pressure on the ship's hull. When the ice breaks up, you can have problems, in other words. Here are a few of his crew members. Frank Hurley was the photographer who took pictures, and thank God he did. So we have a record of it. Frank Wild was his right-hand man. He was a chap that he gave that biscuit to on the other expedition. The captain was Frank Worsley and Mrs. Chippy in Blackborough. They found 2 stowaways. One was the cat, Mrs. Chippy, and the others was Jack Blackborough. Also, it's Shackleton, some of his crew, and this seaman here, Tom Crean, was what you call salty. I assume you know what salty means, right? Very experienced seaman, had been on most of the expeditions to the Antarctic, both with Scott and Shackleton previously. Now, the Endurance, the ship, got caught in this pack ice, right? The ice started breaking up, and the pack ice started forming, and it started crushing the ship. This is an example of pack ice here. Another example of pack ice. This is an example of pack ice with a fairly modern ship being crushed in the pack ice in the Antarctic. And this was a Zodiac that landed on some of the pack ice. On November the 21st, 1915, the ship was crushed. I mean, they crushed the ship, and there it's sinking. At this point, it is sinking. And what do? Ooh, you have to abandon ship onto the ice pack, right? And these ice packs are not friendly places to be. Photos Hurley saved for history. Now, so they offloaded their necessary supplies. And they took 3 lifeboats, fortunately. Frank Hurley said, I want to go back and get my photographs. And Shackleton said, no, we don't. We're only taking the bare essentials. He said, look, if we don't have the photographs and something happens to us and we perish, there'll be no record of what we accomplished. So Shackleton said, all right, we'll take 100. So Hurley went back and dove in the frigid water 3 or 4 feet to bring all these photographs out. And fortunately he did, or we'd have no record of it today with photographs for posterity. Then mutiny started to brew. Some of the troops or sailors got off the ship and they said, oh, we're no longer under King's regulations. We're not being paid. That's what King's regulations state. If you're not aboard ship, you're not in active service, we don't pay you, well, then you don't have to listen to the officers. Whoa, well, that was news to Shackleton. And he made it absolutely clear, I don't care what you say. I'm in charge here. I am the leader. Don't worry, you will be paid, and I'll get all 27 of you back to the UK safely and soundly. And there he is. And like they didn't have radios in those days, no communications, on this ice pack floating around the Antarctic. And no food supply to speak of, right? And he stated that you follow my orders, you'll be shot. And after that, they started to call him the boss. Now, so it was beset by ice here. They abandoned the ship here. The Endurance sank a few days later on the 21st of November. Then they made this arduous task, walk north, 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 which we'll get to in a minute. So, pulled the 3 boats with supply. The average weight that each man had to pull was 200 pounds over crevasses, hummocks, water channels, and more. Now, hummocks are when the ice gets together and they build these ice ridges. So they had to climb over them or cut through them, one of the two. And here they are pulling these sleds, which was difficult. They had to kill and eat the sled dogs. They had to shoot Mrs. Chippy. They couldn't afford a seaman to take care of Mrs. Chippy, so they had to shoot her. And they ate the sled dogs for food. And of course, the Englishmen loved their animals, and they certainly hated to do that. And poor Tom Crean was the person that had to put down Mrs. Chippy and the other dogs. 5 months they were on this ice floe. 5 months. And the floe breaks up at night, sending men into the freezing water, right? There you're sleeping in your sleeping bag. All of a sudden, a crevasse opens, a crack in the ice, and down you go. Tom Crean saved 4 men from drowning in this particular case. Once again, an action of the ice floes breaking up. So then they abandoned the life floes. They got to where the ice floes were disintegrating. They're coming to some open water. So into one of the 3 lifeboats, lads, fortunately they had the 3rd boat with them to take over the ice. They pulled these 3 boats over the ice for like 5 months. They finally get to open water. They jump in the boat. Okay, where we're going to go? Well, they had a good navigator in Worsley. 28 days, they spent 6 months on that ice floe. Miraculously, no one died, no one perished, right? Now there would be 7 hazardous days in this open boat on the Antarctic waters. And they hit Elephant Island. This is Elephant Island, somewhat in the area of South Georgia, but actually 800 miles away. And desolate, no food there to speak of, except some birds and seals, which probably saved their life. This is a picture I took going to Elephant Island. And it was a very, very rough sea day. And you can see this monument. They put a monument up here, and we were trying to land on Elephant Island on our Zodiacs at that particular time, but the seas were just too rough, and we couldn't get ashore, unfortunately. However, Shackleton's men did, and they took 2 of the boats, they turned them upside down and made them into makeshift huts. And of course, today they have a monument where those boats were placed. Now, they thought they would then go set out with one remaining boat. 2 were used for huts, 1 remaining boat, and they tried to sail to South Georgia. So Shackleton selected 5 proven veterans, salty men with experience of the sea, and they boarded the James Caird, which is one of the lifeboats that they had. 6 men went, including Shackleton, and this is an actual picture of them pushing off. This is a picture of a replica of the boat. Notice they put canvas on the top, right? McNash, who was the carpenter, managed to put the top on it. And they set off for South Georgia Island. Of course, this is the Cape at sea. You can see how rough it is. That's a picture of one of the replicas again today. Now, what they are, they're up here at Elephant Island at this point here, and they're going to go over to South Georgia. But if you look at Ushuaia is closer, Falkland Islands is closer. They could have gone to these other islands. Any idea why they didn't? Because yes, sir. Yeah, they knew they were there. The reason is, coming through here is the roughest seas in the world. Okay, the Drake Strait. Have you heard of rounding the Horn? No Navy people here, huh? Rounding the Horn means you take a ship around the very bottom of South America, the Horn. And there's an island there called the Horn. You go around the Horn. But all the winds come from the west and they blow easterly. So they couldn't go into the Drake Passage because they'd be going into the wind. So they said our best bet is try for South Georgia. We know there's a whaling station there. The problem is, if they missed it, they were in no man's land. Like, they didn't have a motor on this boat, right? They had oars and a makeshift sail. And they would have been off to South America, or South Africa, and they would have never made it that far. But fortunately, Worsley was a superb navigator. And that's, once again, the ship, the boat they had. Now, on these waters, capsizing is a constant threat. The ice buildup is very dangerous. Ice cold weather and water. And the boat wasn't the sturdiest, and they had 1,200 kilometers to go. You go around that Horn, they have waves 60 feet high. The record wave is 120 feet. You know how high that is? I was on the Ushuaia, and I was on the bridge, and this ship was 238 feet long, and she was a rocking back and forth. And the next thing you look out, and the doors open, and I look down, and there is the ocean, right? And I go, wow, this is dangerous. I better get out of here. So I went down 1 floor below the deck, the main deck, and I was in the library. And they had a nice big sofa, comfortable. And the waves were coming, smashing against the boat, and I love that. I don't get seasick. And I'm going back and forth like in a roller, having a great time. And then the mother of all waves came, wham! She hit that ship. I went back against the couch, or the sofa, and it ripped right off the floor. And it was nailed in not nailed, but screwed in the floor with screws that deep. Boom, it came right off. It flew back, smashed into one bookcase. The ship went the other way, came back, damn near broke my arm, smashed the bookcase over here. I crawled out, and that sofa just destroyed the bookcase. What had happened is when they put the bookcase, or the sofa in, they put bolts in the back, but not at the front, right? So with my weight, nothing was holding it at the front. It came out of there quite easily. And so it was quite a mess it made of the library. However, it was nothing compared to what these chaps were in, like in an 18-foot lifeboat, and that kind of weather. Unbelievable. So South Georgia Island, they finally made South Georgia Island. But as luck would have it, where did they land? They landed here, on the opposite side of the island. And over here was Stomgres, where the whaling station was. So the 6 of them got off. And Shacklin said, whoa, wow, we have a problem. The rudder was damaged. The island's unexplored, but the only chance we have is to walk across the island. So he